My name's John Dunne, and I should say that I'm here in Madison, Wisconsin, in the United States, where I am a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which was actually the first Buddhist studies program in all of North America, was founded here, surprisingly, in the Midwest, not too far from Chicago. And so I do Buddhist studies as part of what I do as an academic, but I've also been practicing Buddhism for more than 40 years. So I try to be what we call a scholar practitioner, where I'm both learning and studying about and teaching about Buddhism, but also trying to practice it. And what we'll do here is this idea of this what we're calling this series as Foundations of Buddhism. We're going to try to explore this really kind of from a standpoint, especially if you're maybe not yet a practitioner of Buddhism or just interested or curious about Buddhism. We're going to approach it in that way. And also it's going to be a bit academic in a sense that we're going to talk about ways of understanding Buddhism that when you do traditional Buddhist teachings, you might not do because it wouldn't be considered necessary or even maybe interesting. But for us, because of especially if we're coming from a kind of European or Euro-American context, there are kinds of things that are important that help us to understand a tradition like Buddhism that are more coming from, let's say, things around history, for example, or culture. And so we'll also consider some of those things as we're trying to understand Buddhism. And the title of this series is also actually the title of a book by my friend and colleague Rupert Gethin in the United Kingdom. And Rupert's book is called Foundations of Buddhism. It's published by Oxford University Press. And it's a good academic introduction. Rupert's also a practitioner, actually. It's a good academic introduction. We're not going to follow that book exactly. I do use it when I teach introductory courses on Buddhism. But I wanted to mention it because it is also a good resource if you want to have a look at that book. So right now we're planning to do 4 weeks. And in this first session, I'll go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of time for questions at the end. And we're hoping to find a way for you to also submit your questions in between sessions. Or if there are things you'd like to know then after the session is over, then we're hoping to figure out a way for you to submit questions that I can use to do our next session. Okay, so let's begin by maybe considering what we mean by this term Buddhism even. So an interesting thing about that word is that it's not a Buddhist word. There's no word that really translates directly as Buddhism. Like an ism is not kind of conceptually even how Buddhists think about their own tradition. One of the terms that is used is actually the word Dharma in Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is one of the original ancient languages of India that Buddhists used. And the word Dharma is really kind of when it has a lot of different meanings, and we'll discover that as we move along. But one of its key meanings is just a teaching. So you can also, one term that we can use is the Buddha Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha. It's kind of Buddhism, but of course, when we say Buddhism, we mean more than the teaching. Buddhism is really trying to describe what in the West we would call a religion, right? So it's not just the teaching, it's the practice, it's the culture, it's the community, it's the sociology, and so on. And so it's important to understand that that word, even Buddhism, is not really, in a sense, kind of if we're trying to understand Buddhism from the inside, so to speak, we want to be careful about the assumptions of saying that it's an ism or even that it's a religion, which is also really very much a Western term. And we'll come back later maybe to discuss the idea of how Buddhism is or isn't a religion. But for now, let's just recognize that even the word Buddhism is a little bit complicated. And another reason it's complicated is that it's a singular. But actually, here's a really important idea in the Buddhist tradition, a very old idea, which is that there are 84,000 different versions of the Dharma. 84,000 Dharma Paryaya, different versions of the teaching. Why is that? And 84,000, by the way, is a traditional number in India, which means, just a whole lot. So there's a whole lot of different versions of the teaching. And why? Because there are 84,000 different personality types. There are 84,000 different personality, a whole lot of different personality types. So there's a version of the teaching that is meant to kind of be tailored to your personality type. That's the basic idea here. So there isn't like a single teaching that's the one true teaching that everyone has to adhere to. There are actually many different styles of teaching and styles of practice. So that's another thing that's a little misleading about that word Buddhism, because it makes it sound like it's all just one thing. And actually, it's not at all. There's a lot of diversity, even within Tibetan Buddhism, which is the style of Buddhism practiced at Gomde. Even within that tradition, actually, there's a lot of variety. And even in the specific tradition of Gomde, which we'll talk about eventually, even in that specific tradition, there is variety. So there isn't, unlike some traditions which kind of insist on uniformity of belief or a practice, there's actually quite a lot of variety in Buddhism. And that's an important thing to understand as well. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all the varieties of Buddhism. And I don't even know all that much about all the varieties of Buddhism. And it would take us way too long to try to go through all of that. But I am going to try to give you some general features that are common across traditions. So even though there's a lot of variety, there is also a lot of commonality across the traditions. And that's so what we are going to try to focus on here when we talk about the foundations of Buddhism is kind of the things that the Buddhist traditions share together. And then we'll point out specific kinds of developments that help us to understand the tradition practiced at Gomde in particular. So one of the things that is shared by Buddhist traditions actually is just the history and you could say even the geography of Buddhism. And the history of Buddhism, as you may know, begins about 500 years before the start of the Common Era, 500 BCE. And it all is taking place in what we call now India. Of course, that's a modern word. It wasn't called India back then. But let me just show you one slide that I think could be helpful here. This is a slide that shows the different, what are called sometimes the four great places. So these are the sites of the Buddha's life himself. And if we zoom in a little bit here, you see, for example, here's Nepal and Kathmandu. There's the modern city of New Delhi. There's Islamabad in what's now called Pakistan. Here's Dhaka in what's now called Bangladesh, and Lhasa in what's in Tibet. And then these four red dots with these labels. These are the four kind of major places of the Buddha's life. So the Buddha's life was happening here in northern India, right pretty close to the river Ganges, the ancient river Ganges that is so important in Indian culture. So you see his birthplace is actually in modern day Nepal. But culturally, obviously, really part of that whole Gangetic plain, what we call the Gangetic plain, the river basin of the Ganges. His enlightenment place is in Bodh Gaya in the modern state of Bihar. He gave his first teaching in Sarnath, which is right outside of the very ancient city of Varanasi, a city founded probably as old as 5000 BCE. And then Kushinagar, right near the border with Nepal, is the place of his death. So this is the kind of the history, or in rather the geography of where the Buddha arose, where he was active. And then we can also talk about kind of three phases of of the development of Buddhism after the Buddha passed away, actually. There's what we can call the early South Asian period. South Asia is this region that we call India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. That's all part of South Asia. And then there's this middle period where the use of the Sanskrit language became very important. We'll talk about that later. And then there's the late South Asian period where kind of there's a whole lot of syncretic activity, putting a bunch of different things together. Sometimes borrowing from other traditions, sometimes activities between Buddhist traditions themselves. But in any case, a really important period. That's also the time when Buddhism goes to Tibet. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a context like that to understand, because I think it's helpful for us, especially if we are educated in the West, it's helpful for us to have a certain kind of historical and geographical understanding about Buddhism. And when we look now in the contemporary world, although there are many different forms of Buddhism, the three main traditions that have had a big impact on the West are, on the one hand, what we call the Theravada tradition. So that is the tradition that is found in modern day Sri Lanka, in Burma, in South Vietnam, in Thailand. And this tradition claims to go back to that earliest period. So it's trying to it has, and I think that claim is really quite plausible. That yes, indeed, this tradition dates back to or is connected to those very earliest versions of Buddhism. And then we have Zen, which is in Japan, which actually comes from what's called Chan in China. And Chan is actually the Chinese pronunciation of a Sanskrit word, dhyana, which means meditation. So this is the meditation school. And the largest impact initially, historically in the West, especially starting in the 20th century, was from Zen, from the Japanese form of this tradition. And it's also known as Seon in Korea. So this style, we can just in general call Zen Buddhism, has also been had a very important impact on modern Buddhism in the West, especially. And then finally, Tibetan Buddhism, which is of course the form of Buddhism that we find in the Tibetan regions, in the Himalayan regions. Those three forms of Buddhism are develop in various ways. But one of the most important ways of understanding the distinction between them is that whereas the Theravada tradition dates back or connects back very deliberately to the sort of early versions of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism are talking about that second phase, a development starting around the year zero, so to speak, of a different style of Buddhism. And we're going to try to understand all of that by mostly focusing actually on the way they develop in India. So definitely by the end of this series, we're going to be talking about Tibetan Buddhism specifically and the tradition that we find specifically in Gomde. But to get there, we're going to really focus initially on Indian Buddhism. So, and we're going to start with that early period. So one way to understand Buddhism is that it's one of the many philosophies that emerge around 500 BCE and somewhat before that are often connected to what are called the Upanishads. So these styles of texts that were written in Sanskrit, this very ancient language, were texts that were trying to understand a particular problem. And that particular problem, there's two aspects of this problem. One of them is that these texts were coming out of a context in which the main practice of that cultural region was a kind of sacrifice, most specifically a fire sacrifice. And here's a picture of a modern picture, a picture taken about 20 years ago of a fire sacrifice in India. And what is quite surprising in a way is that this practice of making fire sacrifice is extremely ancient. It's probably been going on since 5000 BCE and maybe even older. And in India, this practice has been preserved through the transmission of texts that are called the Vedas. And these are texts that are used. A large portion of these texts is devoted to how do you do the fire sacrifice and what are the various kinds of mantras, or even you can call them spells, that you use when you do the sacrifice. And the idea was that you could, in a sense, manipulate the world through the sacrifice. Through the process of sacrifice, you can actually change the world. And that process, and you partially you're doing that by appeasing the gods, by, in a sense, compelling them to do things for you or pleading with them to do things for you. But the question that really came out of this is, well, why would this work? What is the nature of reality such that you could manipulate it and get these kinds of results? I mean, how does the sacrifice really work? So that was one really big question that is present for the Buddha when he's a young person. The second question, of course, or the second issue you could say is actually the problem of suffering. So this becomes a central question for many of these philosophies that emerged during this time. Why are we suffering? How do we free ourselves from suffering? How do we obtain what's called moksha or freedom from suffering? So those two fundamental questions, in a sense, what's the nature of reality and what's the nature of suffering? How do we become free from suffering? Those two questions really are kind of the context for that the Buddha as a young person encounters. So the traditional story of the Buddha is that he was born as a prince. His name was Siddhartha, the Prince Siddhartha, one whose aim has been accomplished. In other words, his father named him that because he wanted to have a son, and now his aim was accomplished, right? So now he has a son. And traditionally, it's said that he was predicted to either become a great king, a kind of emperor, or else a great teacher. And so his father really worried about him becoming a spiritual teacher because he wanted him to, continue in the family business, so to speak. He wanted him to also be a king. He protected him. He tried to keep him inside of the palace all the time. And then finally, as a young man, he says, Dad, I really would like to just go outside once. Of course, the palace compound was very big, and there were lots of things to do and lots of entertainment. And he had lots of sports tournaments. He was said to be a very good athlete and all. But he finally convinced his father to let him out. But his father beforehand prepared the town to make sure that the prince wouldn't see anything that would kind of stir any spiritual feelings in him. So he kind of made sure that there was nothing that the prince could see that would disturb him. But as the prince is going out, he actually does see. Goes out in his chariot with his charioteer, and he has four what are often referred to as the four visions. So first, what he sees actually is someone who is sick. He's never actually seen a sick person before. He's been so protected and leads such a life of privilege that he's never seen someone who's sick. So they're driving along, and somehow there's a person on the side of the road looking, very sick. And then the next thing is, and he says to his charioteer, "What's that?" And that's a sick person. And I know you've never seen that before, but yes, that's a sick person. Next time he goes out, he sees a very old person. He's never even seen an old person before, right? And then the third time he goes out, he actually sees someone who is dead. Now, why is it that, it just so happens that even though the king tried to clean up the town, there's a dead person on the side of the road? I'm not sure how that works, but that's how it is. And then finally, on the fourth time, he sees a spiritual practitioner, someone dressed in the robes of a practitioner, of what's called a wanderer at that time, a shramana. And or someone, even another term for them is someone who has no home, an anagarika, someone who has left his home in order to seek spiritual liberation. So this inspires the Buddha then to actually leave home himself. And there are some wonderful stories about he finally manages to escape from the palace. And he goes off in search of teachers, someone who will teach him how to solve the problems that he now knows are part of the human condition. The problems of birth, of becoming a human who inevitably ends up as someone who is sick, someone who ages, and someone who dies. And then these are all ways of expressing what the core problem of what is called suffering. So let's take a pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what does this suffering mean? Obviously, we understand why it would be suffering, why it's suffering to be sick, why death would be suffering, and aging. I can tell you from experience that aging involves suffering too. But there's actually kind of subtler ways of thinking about suffering. And one of the ways we talk about suffering is in terms of three types of suffering. And by the way, we're going to end up with many lists. Buddhists love numbered lists. So my friend George Dreyfus likes to say Christians love God and Buddhists love lists of things. So one list is the three types of suffering. There's the suffering of suffering. That's just the obvious suffering of pain, like being sick, right? Of feeling arthritis, whatever it might be. And that's also mental suffering, right? You can be in such mental states that also are unpleasant, that hurt. Then there's the suffering of change. And we'll talk more about that. But the basic idea here is that when we have, one way to think about that is that when we have finally get what we want, we lose it eventually. That somehow all of the pleasant states that we're able to obtain are unstable. That our lives, the kind of fluctuation in our lives we experience as suffering. We'll talk more about that later, but I just want to introduce that idea that the suffering is not just about pain, it's also about a kind of instability. It's like a sense of uncertainty even about what's coming next. That's also a kind of suffering of change. And then finally, the subtlest form of suffering is called the suffering of conditioned existence. We'll talk about this also, but in brief, what it means is that even just the way our mind-body system works in our ordinary state as an ordinary person is in a way unfree, that we lack a kind of freedom, that we are conditioned. There's a kind of conditioning that makes it such that we are always caught in a type of prison of our conditioning. And so that also can be experienced as a kind of suffering, especially, they say, as one advances more in spiritual practice. So with those problems in place, the Buddha tries to go out and find teachers who will help him to become free of this suffering, right? This is basically the fundamental problem, is the freedom from suffering. And at this time, you could say there are more or less three different approaches to three different what are called paths. The paths, spiritual path, in Sanskrit, the word marga, the spiritual path that one can follow. One kind of path really relies on what you could say is simply devotion. That if we just devote ourselves to a god, and remember they have more than one god in this cultural context, there are many gods. If I just have full devotion to a god, then the God will protect me, and the God will relieve my suffering. This didn't work at all for the Buddha. It seems like he didn't even consider it seriously as a possibility, at least according to the traditional accounts. Another option is to actually engage in what's called activities. So this was already very much present. So this is called the action, the path of action. So one action that was also very much available to the Buddha that he was already involved in was what we already saw, the idea of the sacrifice. If I just do these actions, these sacrificial actions, that will fix everything. But of course, Buddha had already seen that it doesn't fix everything. You can't do enough rituals. You can't do rituals that will solve the problem of death, for example, that will solve the problem of change. The rituals don't work for that. But another aspect of this approach, the approach of action, is to actually, in a sense, stop acting. So this is a very interesting idea that becomes very powerful for many of the traditions at this time, that the solution to, in a sense, the problems of life is to just stop engaging in ordinary life, and maybe even to stop engaging in anything at all. An extreme version of this was a tradition called the Ajivakas, whose basically practice was to just stop, just don't do anything at all, even stop eating. For obvious reasons, this was not a tradition that lasted very long, but but it was an attitude that was really prominent. And the Buddha tried this actually. Like, I'm just going to sit in a type of extreme meditative posture and not move. He ate less and less. And even part of the idea here is one of the problems, that the reason that we're kind of stuck in suffering is that we have a soul that is sort of crusted over with what we can call karma. We're going to use that word a lot, and we'll talk more about it. But we can say there's a kind of gunk that's surrounding the soul, and the soul is stuck in a body surrounded by this kind of stuff. And by not acting, we don't make more stuff that's encasing the soul. But now we need to do something more than just not act. We need to actually burn it out. So this is the idea that you engage in what's called ascetic practice, which are practices that are deliberately using pain, actually, and deliberately using very intense physical experience to try to burn away all of that stuff that is covering the soul. And so it's recounted that the Buddha, for example, would surround himself with four large fires in the middle of the summer, which is very hot in India, even at that time, and meditate in the noonday sun and use the heat to try to burn out those causes of his suffering. He would eat very little and even got to the point, they say, when he could push on his stomach and touch his backbone. So that's pretty thin. It's rather extremely thin. But this also did not work for him. And there's said to be a time, one part of the tale recounts how he's realizing these practices that my teachers have taught me, this is not working. These activities, engaging in thinking that I can just burn out my suffering by doing these actions, that doesn't seem to be working. I'm still experiencing suffering. And so he actually decides to start eating. And at the time, he was practicing with some other friends, and they were shocked when he accepted from, there was a cow herder nearby, and she offered him some rice gruel, like kind of rice soup, and he started to eat. And they thought, wow, this guy, he's not our friend anymore. But then the Buddha came upon a different approach. And this is something that it is said, in a way, he'd heard some of this from his other teachers, but he really developed his own approach. And that approach was one that really is not a path of devotion, not a path of action, but it's a path of knowledge. And this was definitely something that was common to other traditions at that time. And the path of knowledge is that the solution to suffering is understanding reality. So that's how it connects to that other question. Remember, why does the sacrifice work? What's the nature of reality? Well, for this path, specifically understanding the nature of reality is what removes suffering, is what eliminates our suffering. Because the idea here is that our suffering is coming from our confusion about the nature of reality. And more specifically, our suffering is coming from confusion about the nature of our own identity, who we are, who am I really? So you can think about it this way. Basically, what am I looking for? I want to find freedom from suffering. I want to find, even you could say, happiness. But everything I do that I try to make myself happy, it doesn't seem to work. So the problem, and this, again, all the other traditions that follow the path of knowledge would agree with this, the problem is I don't understand my own true nature. And because I don't understand my own true nature, every time I try to do something that will make me happy, it somehow doesn't work. So for example, if I think, I'm a car, then I could go into a petrol station and just, drink some petrol, and then, yeah, nope, that somehow doesn't work, right? Nope, but petrol didn't make me happy. Whoops, right? So the problem there is that I'm not understanding my true nature. And because I don't understand my true nature, then whatever I do to try to make myself happy doesn't work. So that basic idea, shared across many traditions, is also what the Buddha engages with. But as we will see, he's going to come up with a very unique solution, right? He's going to come up with a different way of understanding the nature of reality, specifically the nature of our own personal identity. And that's what's going to be unique about what he discovers. And what he discovers is not just a kind of intellectual, philosophical point of view. It's actually going to turn out to be a point of view that has to be experienced. So when we say it's a way of knowledge, it's not abstract knowledge. That's involved. There is a kind of philosophical thinking that is necessary, but it's that philosophical thinking only works if it becomes a way of inducing an actual experience. So it's not just thought or ideas, it's experience itself, which really is the key here. The path of knowledge is really as a path of experience, of experiencing the nature of reality, experiencing especially the nature of our own selves. Who am I really? What am I really? Those kinds of questions are really key. So then it said after the Buddha had this realization, and this is then when he becomes what we called enlightened or awakened. So before then, he's the Prince Siddhartha, right? And his family title is Gautama. So Siddhartha Gautama. But when he finally then, remember it's in modern day Bodh Gaya in India, what we call Bodh Gaya, when he sits under this tree and says, I'm not going to rise from this meditation until I have attained awakening. That's at that moment then, late at night, when he attains awakening, that's when he becomes a Buddha. And that word is a very interesting word. A Buddha is one who is awakened. It comes from a verb, buddh, which means to wake up, like to wake up out of a dream or a nightmare. And that's one metaphor that's used, that we're awakening from the nightmare of suffering. But also it means blossoming, like actually it's connected to the English word budding. The flower is budding. It's the blossoming of your own capacities, the full blooming of one's own capacities. And so a Buddha is one who is both awakened from suffering, awakened out of the state of suffering, but also who is fully blossomed into full realization. And so sometimes we hear the term enlightenment. This is actually, there are some metaphors in the tradition that talk about light, but that's not the main way of talking about this state. The main state is really this word bodhi, awakening, or one who is awakened, a Buddha. And so when we think about it, it's helpful to use that term because bodhi has that sense of waking up. Also that sense of like when you wake up, you're kind of not just coming out of something, but you're moving into something of full awakening, a full blossoming. Now I say that he became a Buddha, not the Buddha. And that's really important because part of what the Buddha will teach, and his next activity will be teaching, we'll talk about that in a minute. Part of what he's going to teach is actually that this is something anyone can obtain. Any sentient being, not just humans, any sentient being is capable of becoming fully awakened, becoming a Buddha. And in fact, there have been many Buddhas in the past, and there will be many Buddhas in the future. So the concept here is that awakening is not, so the Buddha is not someone who in a sense has something that no one else can do. The Buddha is actually just fully realizing the potential that everyone has. So that's going to be a really key aspect of the teaching, because what that means is that the process that the Buddha used in order to become awakened, in order to become free from suffering, is a process when he teaches, he's saying everyone can do this. That's a key element of his teaching. We'll talk a little more later about some other features of a Buddha, but for now, let's then go on to his final activity. Rather, not the final activity, but in a sense, the most important activity of those four great places. We talk about the place where he was born, the place where he became awakened, and then the place where he gave teaching, and of course the place where he died. It's that third one, the teaching, that is especially important. Because of course, if that didn't happen, none of us would have access to the philosophy and the practice that he passed along, which has come to us, down to us to this day. And that teaching, so he leaves Bodh Gaya and he makes his way. He wants to go find his former friends, and they've moved up to outside of the ancient city of Varanasi into a park in the place called Sarnath. And he finally encounters them there. And when they first see him, they say, "Oh, look, there's Siddhartha. Don't talk to him. Remember, he started eating and all that stuff. You know, he's not burning out his bad karma anymore. So just don't talk to him." But then he walks up to them and they can't resist. And they all sort of stand up and greet him and say, "Wow, you look special. What's happened to you?" And that's when he gives his first teaching. So this is what we call the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. So that's the metaphor that's used here, the turning of the wheel. So the symbol of the wheel, which is also the international symbol of Buddhism, one of the international symbols of Buddhism, is the idea is that this is instead of, so the wheel, one of the things the wheel represents is the wheel of a chariot, in the sense that a chariot is used to conquer in war, to conquer others, to conquer the world. And in fact, the Buddha, when he was predicted to become a great emperor, it was said that he would be a wheel-turning monarch, a monarch who conquers the entire world. And so his chariots and other kinds of amazing kind of military devices that are described he would use to conquer the entire world. But instead of doing that, he's not conquering the world through military might. There's a different kind of conquest. He's conquering our suffering. It's what we call Dharma Vijaya, Dharma conquest, and conquering through love and compassion, and especially through wisdom, through seeing the nature of reality, the nature of our own identities. So that idea of turning the wheel of Dharma is a metaphor we use for the teachings. And as we will see, we talk about three different kinds of teaching. There's the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, is the teaching that the Buddha first gave to his friends in Sarnath. But then there's going to be two other turnings of the wheel of Dharma, the second and the third, and we will talk about those later. But I just want to introduce that idea now that already there's a sense in which when the Buddha is teaching, and even in the earliest texts we can see this, the Buddha is teaching to particular people for particular purposes, and he says things to different people for different reasons. It's not all just one single teaching. However, that first teaching does hold some common elements that really shape all of the Buddhist traditions in one way or another. An interesting thing about Buddhism is that it doesn't have a creed, actually. So what makes you a Buddhist is not believing anything in particular. That's important to understand. Technically, what makes you a Buddhist is going for refuge in what we call the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dharma, which is the teaching, and the Sangha, which is the community. Again, we'll talk about that more next time. The triple gem. That's technically what makes you a Buddhist. But you can believe anything you want. You could even believe things that are totally contradictory to the Buddhist tradition. And if you've taken refuge, you're a Buddhist. You know, you may be a little confused as a Buddhist, but you're a Buddhist, right? So that's important to recognize. And precisely because the way Buddhism, even from the earliest period, develops, is there isn't just a single kind of essential teaching. Having said that, this first teaching is really fundamental. And you could say that it is, at the core, it's a foundation of all forms of Buddhism. And this is the teaching on what we call the Four Noble Truths. This is the most common translation, what's called the truths for people who are nobles, or Aryas. Now, this word here, what it refers to, it originally actually in Sanskrit, it kind of refers to someone who is of a very high birth. someone who is in the highest level in the caste system. But the Buddha is going to reinterpret this term, and it's going to mean someone actually who has reached that point of spiritual development where they really do see, experientially see the nature of reality. That's really what a noble person means. So when these are described as the noble truths, sometimes a slightly better translation of that actually but it's awkward, is the truths for nobles. These are things that are true for people who have the spiritual capacity to see that they are true. And there's even a famous story that the first person the Buddha encounters, the Buddha tries to, after he's on the way to see his friends, and he meets somebody else, another mendicant, another wanderer, another practitioner. He meets them on the road, and this other person also says, "Wow, something's happened to you. What's up?" And then the Buddha tries to explain, basically the same teaching to that person, and the person says, "Ah, what are you talking about?" And then leaves. So there's this interesting story in the tradition that the first person the Buddha encounters said, "Yeah, that's not true," right? So it's true. These are true if you're ready for them to be true, in a sense, if you're in a certain place, a certain level of understanding. So what are these four truths? Truths for nobles. There's four spiritual truths, meaning things that are true for people who are advancing on the spiritual path. They are, first of all, that there is suffering, right? So that's the core problem, the problem of suffering. The second is and we've talked a little about that. We'll say more next time. The second is that there is a source, an origin of suffering. The third is that there is cessation of suffering. It is possible to obtain cessation. And one word for that cessation is nirvana. And then finally, there's a path. The fourth truth is that there's a path that one can follow. Really, there's many paths taught that are part of the Buddhist tradition that one can follow to obtain the cessation of suffering. So these four truths are key they're really foundational for Buddhism. And that's what next time we'll be focusing on those four truths. We're going to move to questions in a minute, but let me just say a little bit more about what's about those truths, which is really quite interesting. One thing that is probably for us sort of really obvious with our educations is just a kind of fairly sophisticated notion of causality. If you plant a seed, you get a sprout. But more than that, if you plant a seed, and then there have to be certain conditions, you have to have water and fertilizer and so on. You have to have light. The seed has to be a healthy seed and so on. We understand that causality is a very complex process. But the idea of having, first of all, a sophisticated idea of causality, and then applying that to one's own mind-body system, and understanding the problem of suffering in terms of causality was, at that time, 2,500 years ago, was actually kind of revolutionary. Like being very clear, like this is a problem that we can solve by working with the causes of that problem. So the structure of the four truths is really about cause effect, right? So what's the effect? Suffering. What's the cause? The origin of suffering, right? What's called the origin is referring to the causes that produce suffering. And what happens when we take away, or how do we take away those causes? We practice a path. That's the fourth truth. We practice a path to attain another result, a different result, which is the cessation of suffering, or nirvana. So the first truth, the suffering, is the effect of the second truth, the cause. And the third truth, nirvana, is the effect of the fourth truth, the path, right? So that kind of structure is really important to understand, that there is a real clear idea that this is a process that we're caught up in. And there is, in a really important idea here is, it's possible to change that process. We are not stuck. We are capable of doing something about that process. And I'll just end here with this last point, which is We already said that this is a path of knowledge or of wisdom is another term you could use. We have to understand the nature of reality, especially in terms of the first uh, teaching, the first turning of the wheel, that we don't understand the reality of our own selves, the nature of our own identities. And so again, that's not something that just the Buddha had. Many other Upanishadic philosophers also had this idea. The Buddha is going to come up with a very different solution to this problem, however. The other philosophers are going to emphasize that there's some kind of a soul or some kind of spiritual essence that they call Atman in Sanskrit. And that we have to find what there's like a ghost in the shell, so to speak. There's some like entity inside of this body that's almost like trapped in the body. And we just need to free it so that it can fly up into heaven, so to speak. And the Buddha is really going to question that idea. He's going to say the problem is not that we don't understand the nature of that kind of soul. The problem is that we think we have that kind of soul at all, right? That we don't have that kind of soul, that Atman. That doesn't mean we don't exist at all. Obviously, we exist, right? But it is like this. We have a way of thinking about who we are as each of us. This is the claim. We have a kind of natural, innate way of thinking about our own identities, which is confused. And the confusion is especially about the idea that we have some kind of fixed, absolute, unchanging identity. So that's going to be what the Buddha says, and that's what's unique about his solution to this problem. That the understanding and experience we have to come to is to recognize that we don't have that kind of identity. Instead, we have a completely interdependent identity, an identity that is radically connected, an identity that also is, in a sense, infinitely flexible. So we'll be exploring that next time. But for now, if you have any questions about what I've said, or it's some other questions you'd like to raise in these last 12 minutes, please go right ahead. And we can also do that in the chat, I think, if you're online. I'm going to just open up my chat here, make sure I've got it. And so, yeah, anyone, if you have a question, or if there's things you'd like to hear for next time, you can also raise that now. Here's a question in the back there, Sarah. Yep. Can you help moderate yeah, just if I don't see somebody's hand up in the room there, just
do you hear him when he speaks?
go ahead. Yes, I can hear. Yeah.
Did the Buddha say something about the true nature of reality? Like what he found out in his practice on his path of wisdom?
Yes, correct.
What was that?
Well, it depends on who he was talking to. He said actually different things to different people. And that's going to be part of what we're going to learn is how that works, actually. But a foundational thing that like at this first layer, the one aspect, the one teaching that you could say is sort of foundational, right? That then gets a certain type of revision later, as we will see. But this foundational teaching is that the claim is my suffering does come from not understanding my own true nature. So when I try to if I don't understand what I am, like I think I'm a car, I drink gasoline, that's not going to work. I'm not a car. So if I don't understand my own true nature, then I can't become free from suffering and I can't find genuine happiness. And his claim is that we think we have some kind of essential, absolute, unchanging identity. That's like there's somebody in there who's in charge. The real you who is moving your body. The real you who is seeing from behind your eyes. The real you who's doing the talking. This unchanging, that's a key aspect of it. Unchanging, singular, the real you who's the owner and controller of your mind-body system. That is an illusion, according to the Buddha. And if we try to make that kind of person happy, we will never succeed because you can't make a non-existent thing happy. So
Thank you.
that's, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. No.
Does that make sense? Yes. So good, great. That is what's called this is we refer to this as the idea of non-self or selflessness, anatman. So that's a core teaching of the Buddha, a foundational teaching, selflessness. But it's very important, and we'll talk more about it next time. Very important to understand. It doesn't mean, and sometimes when I talk about this, or I write about it, I use self with a capital S. And sometimes and I did today, I'll even use the word soul instead of self, because sometimes that works, that we have the sense that we have a kind of soul that is this unchanging essence, that's who we truly are. That can kind of work. These are different ways of trying to translate that Sanskrit word Atman, which some of you may have heard of. But the Atman, and then you could think, I think, that it really does make a lot of sense. And I work with neuroscientists, cognitive scientists a lot. And there is a way in which it's pretty clear that we have a kind of innate sense of self that is illusory, actually, even from a scientific standpoint. And that's what the Buddha really hones in on.
There's a question online now from the.
Yes, I see that. So let's see. Klaus was asking, if I understand correctly, Buddha was the first to counter the exotic models of liberation in other religions, devotion, action, and stop engaging with a scientific analysis. But doesn't Tibetan Buddhism at least still have these elements, e.g. devotion to and offerings to deities, the idea, the six realms of existence, etc.? Yes, so thanks for your question, Klaus. You could certainly call, in a way, what the Buddha was doing was definitely an analysis, a careful analysis, and we talked about it in terms of a causal analysis. And in that way, and it definitely has a resonance with science. But the Buddha was still living in a cultural context in which there were deities, so he didn't deny kind of many of the cosmological assumptions about you refer to the six realms of existence. That means different kinds of entities that exist in the world, and how one can in our universe, if you like, and how one can be reborn in these different kinds of states. We'll talk about rebirth next time. So he didn't really deny all of those things because it wasn't necessary, I think you could say, to deny them. But he also didn't necessarily simply approve of them. So there were a lot of kind of assumptions about cosmology and other beliefs that you could say were just accepted without either critiquing them or affirming them, because that was the culture that he was living in. I think that's one way to think about it. In contemporary practice, of course, sometimes Westerners really go very far and they try to reject all of these things and say, oh, it's just superstition. But it's important to recognize that practices like devotion, and we'll see why devotion is important in Tibetan Buddhism in particular. There is a reason why it becomes very important. It becomes a tool for obtaining wisdom, a tool for reaching the point of actually experiencing the nature of reality. So when we say something is a jnana marga, a path of wisdom, a path of knowledge or wisdom, it is what we don't mean that it can't have other methods. And this idea of method is very important, especially as Buddhism develops. And one of the methods different people need different methods, but all of those methods, things like devotion, for example, making offerings, prayers, and such, they all are designed for one kind of endpoint, which is the production of that kind of wisdom, right? So it's that wisdom, those methods are for wisdom. If I think that my devotional actions themselves are going to free me from suffering, then I'm confused from a Buddhist standpoint. That doesn't mean there aren't Buddhists who, again, you can be a Buddhist, a member of the community, and hold all kinds of beliefs. And certainly there are Buddhists who maybe think just devotion in itself will work. And there are even Buddhist traditions that kind of say that. Not exactly, but are kind of like that. But the point here in this foundational level of teaching is that really the thing that frees us from suffering is understanding the nature of reality. That's key. And whatever works to get you to that understanding of nature of reality, yeah, that's great. That's a method. There are lots of things that won't work, but there are many different varieties of methods. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. Other questions? Thank you, Klaus. Other questions? One more question. There we go.
Did the Buddha talk about flowing of energies inside the body?
In the early texts, probably. I don't know some of those early texts well enough to be sure. Those basic ideas were definitely present, even in that period. They developed more later, at least they become, sort of manifest in the world, so to speak, later. The tradition will say that specifically our tradition, but really all Buddhist traditions will attribute their teachings to the Buddha himself. So there are in Tibetan Buddhism there are tantric teachings, and the traditionally we hold that those teachings were taught by the Buddha himself, or at least some of them were. And those are definitely about energy and so on. But they were kept secret for a very long time. There are other teachings, non-tantric teachings that we'll talk about later around the philosophy of emptiness, for example, that also, it said, were taught by the Buddha during his lifetime, but were kept secret. The traditional answer to your question would be yes, for sure, he taught teachings about energy because he taught tantric teachings. But if we just look at the teachings that are available to us historically, kind of using a Western academic modality, he certainly was aware of those kinds of ideas, and I can't right now come up with a particular text, but I'm pretty confident that there's some mention of this type of thing in some of the texts, but it was not a major aspect of Buddhist practice in that period. So the kind of text that we have from an historical perspective from that time that were available in the world, those texts really did not, as far as we can tell, really involve kind of manipulations of energy as an explicit major part of the practice. Later, that type of practice becomes very important, but not at that time, as far as we can tell. For at least not for the majority of the community, and not for what was publicly available and what comes down to us to this day.
Sure.
So one thing I'll say finally is that when we talk about the teachings from that time, so Sanskrit was the ancient language. It was like a mother tongue, a spoken language, probably dating back maybe to the year 10,000 BCE, maybe, where it's a little unclear. And so the Vedic texts are originally from a spoken language. They're kind of poetic texts, but they're, a language that was spoken. But by the time of the Buddha, Sanskrit was it was kind of like Latin became in medieval Europe. It was no longer really somebody's first language or mother tongue. And so the Buddha spoke in what's called a Prakrit, it's kind of like, street Sanskrit, if you like. It's where languages tend to get simplified. And so things that are more complex get simplified, and vowels change sometimes, especially consonants change together. So the language that the contemporary Theravada tradition uses is called Pali, and it's sort of derivative from Sanskrit. It's like this kind of, not exactly, but it's similar to the relationship between Italian and Latin, or like Old Italian and Latin. It's not exactly like that, but close enough. So in Pali, sometimes I want to mention this because if you're studying Buddhism, you may sometimes, for example, see that instead of talking about the Dharma, Dharma is how we write that, Dharma, people will talk about Dhamma, Dhamma, Dhamma. So that's where they're taking the complex consonant, RM, and they're making it a little easier to say, like Dhamma, instead of Dharma, Dhamma. So you'll also hear, instead of nirvana, you hear nibbana, right? So just to be clear that the language of that ancient period actually is not Sanskrit anymore for the different forms of Buddhism that are arising after the Buddha. They're using local languages. Later, Sanskrit comes back, and we'll say a little more about that in one of our next sessions. But just in case you are reading and you see, oh, he said Dharma, but this says Dhamma. That's because if you're reading about the Theravada tradition in particular, again, the tradition we find in who wear orange robes, or in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, South Vietnam, that those in their texts are not going to use Sanskrit. They're going to use Pali, which is derived from Sanskrit. Okay, I think we're at the end, and one traditional thing we do in Buddhism, and eventually, we'll probably start to introduce some kind of Buddhist elements into how we do these sessions. And one traditional thing that we do, practice that we do, is what's called the dedication of merit. And we just basically take, if you just pause for a moment, collect your thoughts, and just take whatever is positive, the positive energy from what we've done here, and dedicate it to the relief of suffering. So take a moment to do that. And then a traditional Tibetan prayer for this would be Sunandi Tanji Zibani Tobni Nyebe Janam Pamjene Kega Naje Bala Juba Isibe Zole Jowa Jowa Sho.